Imagine standing on a rooftop in London, the night sky glowing red, not from the setting sun, but from burning buildings. Bombs are falling, glass is shattering, the ground shakes beneath your feet. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, one man stands tall, not a soldier, not a general, but a volunteer fire warden named William Sansom. His weapon is not a rifle, but a bucket of sand, a stirrup pump, and sheer determination. This is his story. London in September 1940 was a city under siege. The Blitz had begun, and German bombers swept across the skies almost every night, determined to break the spirit of the British people. But where the Luftwaffe brought destruction, ordinary civilians brought resilience. Among them was William Sansom, a young man who by day worked in a bank and by night became a member of the Auxiliary Fire Service, the civilian volunteers who battled the infernos caused by incendiary bombs. Sansom was not a soldier in uniform, yet he and his fellow fire wardens faced dangers every bit as real. The Blitz turned civilians into frontline defenders. Their job was not glamorous. They carried buckets of water and sand to extinguish burning magnesium bombs, patrolled rooftops in the middle of raids, and directed Londoners toward air raid shelters. In an era before modern firefighting equipment was widely available, their courage was their greatest tool. He described his nights in vivid detail later, writing prose that captured the strange mixture of fear, awe, and adrenaline that filled those hours. Imagine running into a street where every building is on fire, where heat is so intense it feels like standing in front of a giant oven, where the sound of bombs whistling overhead mixes with the cries of people searching for family members. This was the world Sansom stepped into, not for fame, not for money, but because London needed him. The government understood that without civilian volunteers, the city could collapse under the relentless bombardment. Thousands signed up as fire wardens, air raid wardens, ambulance drivers, and rescue workers. Sansom, like many others, was a young man with no experience in disaster response. Yet when the first firebombs fell, training quickly turned into real action. The German strategy was devastatingly simple. Drop thousands of small incendiary bombs that would set fire to homes, warehouses, and factories. These bombs were lightweight and fell in massive numbers. One might be manageable, but 100 in the middle of crowded streets and timber buildings could set entire neighborhoods ablaze. For London, a city of narrow streets and centuries-old wooden structures, this was a nightmare. Sansom recalled how the night sky glowed so brightly during the raids that you could read a newspaper by the light of burning buildings. The city's familiar landmarks, the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, the Thames, the bridges, took on a surreal, almost apocalyptic appearance. Yet in this inferno, men like Sansom kept climbing ladders, running into burning houses and doing the impossible, stopping flames with almost nothing but grit and courage. The tools at their disposal were rudimentary. The famous stirrup pump was essentially a hand-operated water pump, often drawing from a bucket or basin. Fire wardens would crouch next to a burning bomb and desperately spray water or throw sand directly onto the white-hot flames. It was work that demanded nerve. A single hesitation could mean a fire spreading beyond control. And all of this was done while enemy aircraft circled above, ready to drop more explosives at any moment. Yet what stands out most in Sansom's accounts is not the destruction, but the humanity. Fire wardens looked out for each other. Neighbors shared what little they had. When a street was bombed, it wasn't just rubble. It was a community torn apart. And yet people always came together to rebuild. Sansom later wrote about the extraordinary sense of comradeship that existed during those dark nights. Strangers became allies, bound together by survival. One particular night stuck in his memory. A bomb had hit near the docks, igniting warehouses filled with timber and paper. Flames roared like a storm, smoke blackened the air, and sparks flew across the water. For hours, fire crews battled the inferno, while Sansom and his team struggled to contain smaller blazes spreading into nearby streets. They were exhausted, coughing, covered in soot, but they refused to give in. At dawn, as the fires died down, he looked around and saw a city scarred, but still standing. In that moment, he realized the true power of ordinary people. William Sansom's courage was not unique, and that is precisely what makes his story so powerful. He represented thousands of men and women who stood their ground in the face of destruction. Most were never remembered, their names lost in the ash and rubble. But through his later writings, Sansom gave them a voice. He described the Blitz not as a distant military campaign, but as a deeply human experience lived by bakers, teachers, clerks, and volunteers who refused to surrender their city. The Blitz killed over 40,000 civilians across Britain and left millions homeless. But the failure of Germany's strategy lay not in the bombs that fell, but in the spirit they could not break. Londoners, and the fire wardens among them, became symbols of defiance. Winston Churchill famously declared, "We can take it." And men like William Sansom proved him right, night after night. As dawn broke after each raid, the city was battered but alive. Streets were cleared, fires extinguished, children taken to school, as if normal life could somehow continue amid the ruins. Sansom often reflected on this resilience. How could a city so damaged continue to function? The answer was simple: civilians who never gave up. This was the essence of the British Civil Defence Volunteer. They were not warriors trained for glory. They were ordinary men and women who, through courage and persistence, became the backbone of their city's survival. And in telling their stories, we remember not only their bravery, but the lesson they left behind, that even in the darkest night, the light of humanity can burn brighter than fire. When William Sansom first joined the Auxiliary Fire Service, he had no idea what awaited him. To many young volunteers in 1939 and 1940, the idea of serving as a fire warden sounded almost mundane compared to the drama of the battlefield. But the Blitz would prove otherwise. Within weeks, he found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with men twice his age, clerks, bus drivers, and even retired veterans, all united by one simple duty: keep the fires from consuming London. The training was minimal. Fire wardens learned how to recognize different types of incendiary bombs, how to operate stirrup pumps, and how to guide civilians to safety. They studied maps of their neighborhoods, memorizing the quickest routes to air raid shelters, water supplies, and vulnerable buildings. Every warden was given a steel helmet marked with a large W, a gas mask, and a torch. There were no rifles, no bayonets, just responsibility and courage. The Blitz began in earnest on the evening of September 7, 1940, when 348 German bombers, escorted by 600 fighters, descended on London. It was the first of 57 consecutive nights of bombing. For Sansom and his colleagues, this was baptism by fire. That night, whole districts were ablaze, and the Thames glowed with the reflection of burning docks. Sansom later wrote about standing in the midst of it all, the heat blistering his skin, the roar of collapsing buildings echoing like thunder. His duty was simple yet overwhelming: spot fires before they grew too large and direct the firefighters where they were needed most. During those nights, the city transformed into something otherworldly. Streets were deserted, save for wardens moving quickly between buildings, checking rooftops, shouting warnings. The distant hum of planes was always followed by the shriek of bombs. When the incendiaries hit, they scattered across rooftops like sparks from a giant forge. Each one, no larger than a milk bottle, could destroy an entire home. Fire wardens rushed toward them while everyone else ran away. Sansom vividly described one such incident. A bomb had landed on a townhouse, crashing through the roof into an attic. Within seconds, the dry timber caught fire. He and another warden climbed up, carrying nothing more than buckets of sand. The flames licked the rafters, smoke filled their lungs, and they had only moments before the entire house went up in flames. They managed to smother the bomb, coughing and half-blinded, before collapsing outside. It was not a glorious battle, But for the family who lived in that house, it was the difference between survival and ruin. The fire wardens were not alone in their struggle. Alongside them were the full-time fire brigades, the rescue squads, and the ambulance drivers, many of whom were women. Yet the wardens held a unique role. They were embedded in their neighborhoods, the familiar faces that reassured frightened families and directed them to safety. In a way, they became the glue that held communities together. People trusted their local warden, because he or she was not an abstract figure in uniform, but the man down the street or the woman from the corner shop. Despite the exhaustion and danger, Sansom often marveled at the resilience of Londoners. He recalled a night when, after hours of battling flames, he stumbled into a pub that had miraculously survived the raid. Inside, civilians were singing, glasses raised in defiance of the destruction outside. It was as if the city itself refused to surrender, he later wrote. For the fire wardens, these moments of normalcy gave them strength to face another night of chaos. One of the greatest challenges was the psychological strain. Every night, wardens walked into danger, knowing they might not return. Sansom spoke of the eerie silence after the all-clear sirens, when the fires still smouldered and the streets lay in ruins. He remembered stepping over shattered glass, past homes reduced to rubble, listening to the faint cries of people trapped beneath the wreckage. The work was never truly done. Even when the planes left, the aftermath demanded relentless effort, guiding rescuers, calming survivors, and digging for those who might still be alive. And yet, the wardens were ordinary civilians. They returned home at dawn, often to bomb-damaged houses, sharing the same hardships as the people they protected. Sansom himself endured sleepless nights, his nerves frayed, but he continued to volunteer. It was not duty in the military sense. It was duty to neighbors, to community, to humanity itself. The courage of these men and women was not measured by medals or parades. In fact, most of their names were never recorded, but their presence made all the difference. When Londoners looked up at the night sky and saw it lit with fire, they also saw silhouettes of wardens on rooftops, helmets gleaming, fighting back in their quiet, desperate way. That sight gave them hope. The Blitz lasted for months. Night after night, Sansom patrolled, climbed ladders, carried sandbags, and faced firestorms that seemed unstoppable. Some nights blurred together into a haze of smoke and exhaustion. Others stood out with unforgettable clarity. The night the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral seemed certain to fall, yet somehow remained standing. The night whole streets were reduced to ash, yet survivors emerged determined to rebuild. In time, Sansom began to record his experiences in writing. His prose was not detached or clinical, but deeply human, filled with sensory detail and emotion. He captured the strange duality of the Blitz, the terror of bombs falling, and the incredible sense of solidarity among those who endured them. His words later became some of the most vivid literary accounts of civilian life during the war, preserving the memory of the fire wardens for generations. Above all, Sansom's story reminds us of the extraordinary bravery hidden in ordinary lives. He did not seek fame or recognition, yet by telling his story, he gave voice to thousands of anonymous men and women who stood guard over their city in its darkest hours. Their battles were not fought on distant battlefields, but on the rooftops and alleys of London. And though they carried no weapons, their resolve was as strong as any soldier's. The fire wardens of London showed that heroism is not always about defeating an enemy. Sometimes it is about refusing to give in, about holding the line between destruction and survival with nothing but courage and determination. And in that quiet defiance, they proved that even under relentless attack, the human spirit could not be broken. There is one night in particular that has gone down in history as perhaps the most destructive single raid of the Blitz. It was the night of December 29th, 1940, often called the Second Great Fire of London. For William Sansom, it was a night he would never forget, a night when the city seemed on the verge of being consumed entirely by flames. That evening, German bombers launched a concentrated attack on the heart of the capital, dropping more than 100,000 incendiary bombs on the city of London. The target was not the docks or the suburbs this time, but the very centre of commerce and history, an area dense with warehouses, offices, and ancient churches. In a matter of minutes, the district was ablaze, a raging inferno that would burn throughout the night. Sansom and his fellow wardens were dispatched into the chaos. The scene they encountered was beyond imagination. Whole blocks were on fire, the narrow medieval streets funneling flames like chimneys. The sound was deafening, crashing timbers, collapsing walls, and the constant drone of aircraft above. The air was thick with smoke and sparks, stinging the eyes and searing the lungs. To many who were there, it seemed as if London itself was being reduced to ashes. Among the most iconic images of that night was St. Paul's Cathedral, rising above the smoke and flames. At several moments, it appeared that the great dome would be lost, consumed by the fires raging all around it. For Londoners, St. Paul's was more than a church. It was a symbol of endurance, a reminder of faith and stability amid chaos. Fire wardens, firefighters, and volunteers fought desperately to protect it, beating out incendiaries that landed on the roof, spraying water from makeshift pumps, and risking their lives on precarious ladders high above the city. Sansom later described how surreal it felt to be part of that effort. He remembered looking up at the great dome glowing in the firelight, the smoke swirling around it, and thinking that if it fell, the city's spirit might fall with it. But somehow, against all odds, St. Paul's survived. Photographs taken that night, showing the cathedral standing tall amid a sea of flames, became one of the most powerful symbols of British resistance. For Sansom and his colleagues, there was no time for awe. Their work was relentless. Each incendiary had to be dealt with quickly before it could ignite a building. The bombs were small but insidious, hissing and spitting sparks as they burned with white-hot intensity. The wardens carried buckets of sand, climbing into attics, scrambling across rooftops, often with little protection from falling debris. It was exhausting, dangerous, and at times terrifying, but it had to be done. That night, London came closer to collapse than ever before. Entire streets vanished in the flames. The Guildhall, centuries old, was gutted. Churches that had stood since medieval times were reduced to rubble. The firestorm was so intense that the river itself seemed to glow with reflected light. And yet, amid this destruction, ordinary men and women held the line. Sansom remembered the strange contrasts of those hours. In one moment, he would be battling flames in a warehouse filled with books, the pages fluttering like burning leaves through the air. In the next, he might stumble into a courtyard where volunteers were calmly brewing tea for exhausted firefighters. It was this mix of chaos and humanity that defined the Blitz. Destruction on an unimaginable scale, and yet an unshakable determination to carry on. The courage of the fire wardens that night was not about great victories or dramatic rescues. It was about persistence. Every bomb extinguished was a small triumph. Every building saved was a victory for the community. Sansom and his comrades worked through the night, lungs burning, eyes streaming, bodies aching, driven only by the knowledge that if they stopped, the city might be lost. When dawn came on December 30th, the scale of the devastation was clear. Much of the city of London lay in ruins, yet St. Paul's still stood, scarred but intact. For Sansom, that sight was unforgettable. The cathedral rising above the smouldering wreckage was proof that the city had not been defeated, that despite everything, something vital had been preserved. The newspapers quickly seized on this image. Photographs of St. Paul's, shining through smoke, were published around the world. To many, it was a miracle. But Sansom knew it had not been a miracle at all. It had been the work of countless unnamed wardens and firefighters who had risked everything to protect it. Their courage had made survival possible. As the months wore on, Sansom continued his service. Each night was a test of endurance, each raid another chapter in the long struggle of the Blitz. He grew accustomed to the routine, the wail of the sirens, the dash to assigned posts, the sudden eruptions of fire, and the weary trudge home after dawn. Yet no matter how often it happened, the sense of danger never left. Every night could be the one when a bomb fell too close, when a fire grew too strong, when luck finally ran out. He often reflected on the strange dual life he and others lived. By day, he worked in a bank, wearing a suit and dealing with ledgers. By night, he put on his steel helmet and fought fires in a city under siege. It was as though two worlds coexisted, one ordinary, one extraordinary, and both equally real. For Sansom, this contrast shaped his understanding of human resilience. He came to believe that the true strength of people lay in their ability to adapt, to endure, to face unthinkable challenges, and somehow continue. The Blitz was not just about destruction. It was also about transformation. Communities forged bonds that might never have existed otherwise. Neighbors who had barely spoken before became comrades in survival. Strangers offered shelter, food, or comfort without hesitation. Sansom's writings captured this spirit of solidarity, describing how, in the midst of chaos, the best of human nature often emerged. He recalled how, on the morning after a raid, shopkeepers would sweep glass from their doorways, children would resume their games in the rubble, and life against all logic carried on. The resilience of London was not just in its buildings, but in its people, and the fire wardens, standing watch through the nights, were both guardians and witnesses to that resilience. By the time the worst of the Blitz ended in May 1941, Sansom and his fellow wardens had endured 8 months of almost nightly raids. The city was scarred, but it had not fallen. Londoners had shown a defiance that confounded the enemy's expectations. And at the heart of that defiance were ordinary volunteers, men like William Sansom, who had faced fire with nothing more than determination and a sense of duty. In his later years, Sansom would become a respected writer, his wartime experiences shaping much of his work. But his greatest contribution may not have been his books, but the example he set as a civilian who stood firm in the face of destruction. His story is a reminder that history is not only written by generals and politicians, but also by those who quietly carry buckets of sand into burning buildings, determined to protect their homes and neighbors. For William Sansom, the nights of fire and smoke were not just episodes of external destruction. They became battles within the human mind, tests of endurance that scarred memory and shaped emotion. The Blitz was relentless, and while bodies could recover from exhaustion, the spirit often bore wounds that could not be seen. The physical danger was always present, but what struck Sansom most was the cumulative weight of living under constant threat. Sirens wailed night after night, forcing people to abandon their beds, to rush into shelters, to brace themselves for whatever might come. For fire wardens, there was no refuge. While others huddled underground, Sansom climbed ladders into the fiery sky, his senses assaulted by the roar of bombs and the sting of smoke. The body adapts, but the mind never truly accepts. He often described the eerie quality of silence after a raid. The fires would still smolder, the streets covered in rubble, but the aircraft were gone. In that stillness, the mind replayed the chaos. Every flash, every scream, every collapse of brick and stone lingered like an echo. For civilians, it was trauma endured in fragments. For wardens, it was trauma layered night upon night, with little time to heal. There were moments that etched themselves permanently in memory. Sansom spoke of searching a ruined house only to find a child's toy among the ashes. He remembered the smell of wet plaster mixed with smoke, the sight of books scattered across a bombed library, pages charred at the edges as if history itself had caught fire. These details became part of him, later reappearing in the prose he would write. The war gave him not just experience, but a language of survival and loss. The emotional toll was not his alone. Fellow wardens struggled with fatigue, fear, and grief. Some lost friends in the raids. Others carried the weight of knowing they had saved one building while another burned beyond their reach. Guilt crept in quietly, a feeling that no matter how hard they worked, it was never enough. And yet, they kept going. To stop would have meant surrender, and surrender was unthinkable. The British government recognized the importance of morale, not only for civilians, but for those in civil defense. Propaganda posters urged wardens to carry on, to stand firm in their duty. Newspapers praised their bravery, but rarely did they capture the exhaustion in their eyes, the tremor in their hands, the haunted look after a night of fire. Sansom later reflected that the true heroism of the fire wardens lay not in dramatic acts of rescue, but in their persistence despite inner turmoil. Humor became a coping mechanism. Wardens often joked about their flimsy equipment, about running toward bombs with buckets, about the absurdity of their nightly battles. Laughter did not erase the danger, but it gave them a moment's relief. In a world where death rained from the skies, a shared joke could be a form of defiance. Sansom himself recalled how, even in the middle of chaos, someone would make a remark that drew genuine laughter, as if to prove that the human spirit could not be extinguished. Art and literature also became forms of survival. For Sansom, writing provided a way to process what he witnessed. After the war, he transformed his experiences into fiction and essays, but even during the raids, he carried an observer's eye. He noticed the surreal beauty of fire reflected in the Thames, the strange calm of people singing in shelters, the dignity with which Londoners faced loss. He captured not only the horror, but also the resilience. The trauma of the Blitz was not confined to those on the streets. Families endured nights in damp shelters, children carried memories of shattered homes, and communities rebuilt themselves again and again. The Blitz spirit, as it came to be called, was real, but it came at a cost. Behind the stoicism and courage was a deep exhaustion, a collective grief that would take years to surface fully. Sansom understood this duality. His writings later revealed not only admiration for the courage he witnessed, but also a sensitivity to the quiet suffering beneath. The war had shown him both the heights of human endurance and the depths of vulnerability. He came to believe that acknowledging both was essential to understanding what London had endured. What gave him strength, and what gave many wardens strength, was the knowledge that their efforts mattered. A fire put out, a family guided to safety, a building saved from collapse. These were tangible victories, however small, and in those victories lay the proof that ordinary people, armed with nothing more than resolve, could stand against forces far greater than themselves. As the months dragged on, Sansom's health began to feel the strain. Nights of little sleep, exposure to smoke and cold, and the constant adrenaline took their toll. But like so many others, he did not step back. To leave the duty felt impossible when others were still out there on rooftops, still climbing ladders, still facing the fires. It was solidarity that kept them going, the unspoken promise that none would abandon the others. In the broader sweep of history, the Blitz became a defining chapter of Britain's war. But for Sansom, it was also an intimate story of faces and voices he would never forget. The fellow warden who carried a thermos of tea for everyone. The elderly neighbour who insisted on staying in her home, stubborn and proud. The children who laughed in the morning as if the night had been just a dream. These were the moments that revealed the heart of London's endurance. Years later, when he reflected on those times, Sansom did not speak only of destruction. He spoke of transformation, of how the war revealed strengths people never knew they had. He had seen men and women, untrained and unprepared, rise to challenges they could not have imagined. And he had seen himself change, from a bank clerk into someone who could stare into flames and still move forward. The trauma never fully left him. Memories lingered, surfacing in unexpected moments. But he also carried with him a profound sense of meaning. To have been part of that struggle, to have stood with his city when it was most vulnerable, was a source of quiet pride. His story, and the stories of countless unnamed wardens, became a testament not just to survival, but to the power of ordinary people in extraordinary times. By the spring of 1941, the heaviest nights of the Blitz were drawing to a close. London still lived under the threat of bombs, but the relentless nightly raids that had once defined existence began to ease. For William Sansom and his fellow fire wardens, this change was not a sudden relief, but a gradual realization. The nights were growing quieter, the skies less filled with the constant drone of engines. Yet even as the frequency lessened, the legacy of those months was written deeply into the city, stones, and into the minds of those who had endured. The scars of war remained visible on every street. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, reduced to skeletal frames of brick and blackened timber. Churches stood roofless, warehouses gutted, streets split open where bombs had torn through pavement. To walk through London in daylight was to see not just the cost of destruction, but the persistence of life. Market stalls reopened in the shadow of ruins. Children played among the rubble, and buses resumed their routes past buildings that stood half-collapsed, like monuments to survival. For the wardens, the easing of raids meant a strange adjustment. After so many months of constant vigilance, the body did not immediately relax. Sansom wrote of how, even when the nights were quiet, he lay awake, listening for the sirens that no longer came. The mind had been trained to expect danger, to anticipate fire, to prepare for action. Peace, when it began to return, felt almost unnatural. And yet, amidst this uneasy calm, reflection became possible. The men and women who had volunteered found themselves looking back at what they had endured, at the friends they had made, and at those they had lost. In that reflection lay a recognition. They had done something extraordinary, though none of them would have described it in those terms. They had kept a city alive under fire. For Sansom personally, the end of the Blitz marked the beginning of a different kind of work. He turned to writing, capturing the texture of nights filled with flame and courage. His words carried the immediacy of someone who had been there, who had seen with his own eyes the strange beauty and the terrible cost of war. He did not romanticize the destruction, but neither did he deny the resilience. His stories became a bridge between those who had endured and those who could only imagine. The legacy of the fire wardens, like that of all civil defense volunteers, was not measured in medals or parades. Most remained anonymous, their names forgotten, even as their efforts saved lives and preserved parts of the city. They were ordinary men and women, clerks, shopkeepers, teachers, retirees, who had taken on extraordinary responsibility when history demanded it. Sansom often emphasized this ordinariness, arguing that it was precisely what made their actions remarkable. They had not sought heroism, but they had found it in the course of duty. In the years after the war, the Blitz spirit became part of Britain's national identity. It was invoked as a symbol of resilience, of unity, of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. But for those who had lived it, the memory was more complex. There was pride, yes, but also grief for what had been lost. There was admiration for the courage of neighbors, but also the unspoken knowledge of trauma carried quietly into peacetime. The laughter, the jokes, the shared cups of tea in fire stations, All of these memories sat alongside the images of collapse and fire. Sansom's life as a writer gave him the ability to transform those contradictions into narrative. Through his words, he ensured that the perspective of the civil volunteer was not forgotten. Too often, histories of war focused on generals, battles, and grand strategies. But in the nights of London's Blitz, history was shaped equally by the anonymous wardens who climbed rooftops with buckets, who guided families to shelters, who stood watch in the dark so others might sleep. The end of the Blitz did not end danger. Later raids, V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets would still strike the city. But by then, the character of London had been forged. The fire wardens, air raid wardens, ambulance drivers, and countless other volunteers had proven something profound, that a city is not only its buildings, but its people. And when those people stand together, even the most destructive force cannot break them entirely. For William Sansom, the war years remained a defining chapter of his life. He carried the memories, the images, the emotions into his literature and into his reflections. He spoke often of the resilience he had witnessed, not the abstract Blitz spirit of propaganda, but the very real human courage of neighbors who refused to give in. His testimony became part of a larger mosaic of memory, ensuring that future generations could understand not just the destruction of the Blitz, but the humanity that persisted through it. The fire wardens themselves faded back into civilian life after the war. Some returned to their old jobs, others moved on to new paths, but most carried little outward sign of what they had endured. Their stories were not always told, their names not always remembered, but their actions left a permanent imprint. Every building that had been saved, every life preserved, was a monument to their effort, even if invisible. Looking back now, it is tempting to see the Blitz only through the lens of history, as a series of statistics and events. Yet when we remember William Sansom, we are reminded that it was also a deeply human experience. It was about the man who stood with a hose on a burning roof, the woman who opened her home to shelter neighbors, the child who clutched a toy while the ground shook. It was about ordinary people who refused to be defined by fear. That is the heart of Sansom's story, and of every unnamed warden's story, not the scale of destruction, but the scale of resilience. Not the bombs themselves, but the refusal to let them destroy the essence of a city. London endured because its people endured. And in that endurance, they left behind a legacy that outlasted the rubble and the flames. Today, as we walk through the streets of London, many of the scars have been repaired, the ruins rebuilt. But if you look closely, there are still traces, church walls blackened by fire, memorial plaques to those who served, quiet markers of nights when the sky burned. These are reminders not only of destruction, but of survival. They are the echoes of the warden's footsteps, of Sansom's watchful eyes, of a city that stood against the fire. In remembering them, we do more than honor the past. We remind ourselves of the power of ordinary courage, of the resilience that can rise when people stand together in the face of the unimaginable. That is the story of the British Civil Defence Volunteer. That is the story of William Sansom, the fire warden who carried the flames of memory into words so we might never forget.